Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight, we'll trace the entire story of the JFK assassination. A bright Friday in Dallas broke without warning. Gunfire cut through a motorcade. A president was killed, and a country entered a long season of public mourning and shaken trust. We will take our time and keep a steady, gentle pace. We will stay close to the people who lived it, and to the quiet ways this day still touches American life. Before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift while we ease into tonight's story. In the years before the JFK assassination, the country moved with a calm public face that hid sharp tensions under the surface. The young presidency spoke of vigor and promise, and television carried that image into living rooms each night. The Cold War shaped budgets and school drills and maps that placed missiles within striking distance. The Cuban crisis had passed, yet the memory of that brink made people value steadiness. Civil rights demands grew louder in the streets and in the courts. The press learned new rhythms for covering a modern White House that traveled often and loved the sight of crowds. A motorcade remained a symbol of openness and trust. Agents rode close, but the gaps between buildings and people felt normal. The sense of safety was not careless. It was simply the way public life worked. Factories ran at high speed, and new suburbs filled with families who believed the future would keep expanding. Airports grew busier as travel shrank distances that once kept presidents far from local scenes. Television networks refined live coverage and learned to pivot from ribbon cuttings to breaking news. The Oval Office sought public contact and built schedules that placed the president in front of friendly and unfriendly crowds. The Secret Service expanded but still relied on a small core of agents who wore many roles on each trip. There were fewer armored cars, and bullet-resistant glass was not routine. The tools that later became standard existed in limited form or remained on the drawing board. In this world, the face-to-face handshake felt like a duty. The road met the people. The people waved back and expected to be close. Law enforcement watched many kinds of threat, yet lacked a shared map that connected every strand. The Cold War produced spies and defectors and sudden returns that confused simple labels. Civil rights gains met backlash that sometimes carried anger into local politics and street corners. The fair play signs and anti-Castro leaflets that appeared in some cities told of a country pulled by argument. Rifles and scopes could be bought by mail with little friction, and false names could pass through loose checks. City skylines added taller buildings and wide windows that opened easily for air. Motorcade routes often ran beneath those lines, since downtown streets were part of the show. Local police posted officers at intersections and on motorcycles. Roofs were rarely sealed. It was common to accept risk in exchange for speed and contact. That acceptance felt reasonable to many. John Kennedy embodied a style that seemed built for the camera and for confident streets. The popular image placed a young couple at the center of a changing decade. Jackie Kennedy spoke with care about history and art, and the White House gained a tone that suggested continuity with older rooms and older grace. Reporters traveled close to the family and learned a beat that mixed policy with scene. In that rhythm, the distance between power and crowd felt smaller each month. The country liked the feeling. That feeling fed choices about security that favored presence over insulation. Staff weighed risks and returned to the same answer. The office needed to be near the public. A trip that gathered votes and calmed factions seemed worth the exposure. Decisions about cars and seating and pace followed from that core view and shaped daily planning. The protective agency carried the burden of the modern stage with numbers that would surprise later generations. The field drew from a tradition that focused on counterfeiters and quiet financial crimes, and the protective mission grew across time rather than arriving fully built. Training covered movement and quick reaction, and the discipline of watching faces in a sea of faces. The tools for long-range threats were less mature. Communications worked but could fail to bind every unit into one flow. Local police served as partners yet followed home habits and home rules. Radios were strong on the ground and weaker across blocks and rooftops. Advance work did walk the route and mark concerns. The markings could not erase physical facts like height and angle, and windows that stood open for air. The culture of the tour placed emphasis on speed and cheerful contact. Violence did appear in the news that year and the year before, tied to civil rights, to local disputes, and to the wide frame of the Cold War. The murder of Medgar Evers shook households that had never heard his name until that night. A church bombing in Birmingham took the lives of girls at Sunday service and sent grief into every city paper. The same pages listed marches that grew, arrests that mounted, and calls for new laws to protect voters and families. The White House had to measure each response while it courted Southern leaders and business voices who feared unrest. Sharp language grew common in some broadsheets and on handbills that spoke to anger with stark terms. The climate did not point to one moment or one place. It pointed to a pressure that made public life more exposed and more fraught. Abroad, the map looked unsettled. The Berlin Wall cut a city and reminded viewers that force could harden into concrete with little warning. Advisors in Vietnam signaled a slow deepening of a far war that still felt distant to most families. In Cuba, a new alignment stood 90 miles from Florida and shaped each election and each speech. These facts formed a backdrop for every trip and every handshake. The American belief in access and ceremony met a world that had grown sharper since the last decade. The balance of exposure and protection kept tilting toward exposure because it seemed to carry political gains. Crowds gave energy to a presidency that often faced narrow margins in Congress. Reporters rewarded spectacle with coverage that reached millions. The calculus had logic that any campaign manager could explain. It also placed risk in view and called it normal. At home, political math pointed to the next election and to states that might decide the outcome. Texas stood large on that list. The ticket in 1960 had relied on the pull of Lyndon Johnson and the complex web of loyalties he knew by name. By 1963, the coalition had frayed in ways that were visible to local leaders and donors. Business groups pushed for attention to growth and defense plans. Conservatives pressed the charge that Washington moved too fast on civil rights and spending. Liberals argued that promises needed action. John Connally sat in the governor's chair and worked to hold a divided party together. The White House looked at these facts and saw a need to visit and to speak. A tour that mixed policy and unity with pageantry felt like the right test of strength before the real season began. Texas changed fast in those years. Oil money and defense contracts brought new offices and new towers to cities that had once felt smaller. Dallas sold itself as modern and efficient and proud of private success. The same city carried groups that spoke in harsh terms about federal reach. Flyers appeared before some visits by national officials and used charged language that stayed in the minds of police chiefs. Church pulpits and service clubs argued over the same themes that played on television. The tone could shift from polite to sharp in a few blocks. Local leaders tried to keep events smooth and safe while still welcoming intensity as a sign of civic spirit. Those mixed signals shaped planning for every podium and every route. They also formed part of the memory once the Dallas motorcade shooting became a phrase that stood for a national wound. Across the country, parades and motorcades created familiar scenes. Convertibles offered clear views for cameras and for families who waved from curbs. Weather often decided whether a top stayed on or came off. In warm cities, the open ride felt natural and kind. The follow car carried agents who watched for sudden moves and who could step up in a beat. Motorcycle officers managed gaps and signaled turns. The idea of sealing an entire path from above would have seemed strange to many city halls in 1963. That kind of plan would have required many more people and more time. The frame of risk did not point there yet. The presence of so many hands and eyes at street level gave confidence that warning would appear in time. Confidence of that sort fed choices that kept the line moving and kept the faces visible. Portable cameras changed what citizens could record and how quickly images could travel. Families bought small movie cameras and loaded reels before vacations and parades. Photographs became a way to prove that a person had stood near history for a moment. Newspapers loved to run those frames because readers recognized the angle of a sidewalk and the look of a city corner. In Dallas, a local man would later provide a film that shaped the way people remember the event. That possibility did not feel unusual at the time. Many bystanders carried cameras to a motorcade as naturally as they carried a coat. The presence of lenses added to the sense that public life was a shared space. The line between witness and participant blurred in a quiet and harmless way. The culture of the lens helped set the scene without warning of what it would capture. All of this shaped the ground that made the JFK assassination possible. It did not foretell the street or the hour of the JFK assassination. It created a way of moving that left gaps a mind could study before the JFK assassination. It encouraged a kind of trust that set the stage for the JFK assassination. The road bent toward Texas, where plans would soon become dates and maps. In the months leading to the JFK assassination, Texas politics pressed the White House to stage a visit that could repair a split party and steady a crucial state. Tension had grown between liberal activists and conservative Democrats who still held many county chairs and business links. Local newspapers argued about tone and loyalty, and columnists warned that a hard crowd could greet a motorcade if feelings were ignored. The vice president urged a trip that would bind wounds in Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas. Donors asked for presents, and county leaders wanted a picture that showed unity. Planners mapped a 2-day circuit that balanced policy speeches with handshakes and short rides through downtown streets. Fort Worth would see the president and first lady at breakfast, and Dallas would hold a luncheon at the Trade Mart to showcase growth and to thank local partners. Between those events lay a motorcade that looked ordinary on paper. The route would move from the airport to the heart of the city along wide boulevards that framed new towers and older brick blocks. It would pass cheering office workers and families on lunch break. That sketch matched the style of public life in that year and felt familiar to every aide. The story of why the path turned through a small park near the rail yards began with parking at the luncheon site and the need to show the downtown core. Advance teams walked the streets and weighed alternatives while they talked with city officers who knew traffic patterns and noon habits. They wanted turns that would slow the cars and let people see the faces in the back seat. That choice carried another effect that no one placed at the center of planning. A slow car is easy to applaud and easy to aim at from a distance. In that season, the second fact rarely drove the plan because anger had not often targeted a president in a public street. Political friction inside Texas added urgency to the visit and colored each decision about where to stand and who would sit where. Governor Connolly wanted a program that lifted the state image before national business leaders and defended his approach to growth. Senator Yarborough, a liberal hero to many, had clashed with the governor and with some aides, and the feud had become a news item. The White House hoped that shared rides and shared photos would cool the story for a time. A sequence that placed the president with both men seemed like a smart compromise that would please different camps. That personal map shaped car assignments and even where each official might smile and wave. The memory of the swarming crowd in San Antonio the day before offered a proof that the open car paid dividends in sight and sound. Weather reports for Dallas suggested a bright day without rain that would make a bubble top seem awkward. The Secret Service kept the follow car close and trusted the habits that had carried many trips without incident. Interior armor and plates did exist on some vehicles in the pool, but curved glass around a convertible remained rare on these tours. The culture of the visit prized ease of greeting and direct sight lines into the rear seat. That culture won the day again. Dallas carried a fresh memory of a civic bruise that worried many hosts. Only weeks before, Adlai Stevenson had visited for United Nations Day and had faced taunts and a blow from a sign, which looked ugly on television and seemed to confirm a reputation for harsh politics. Local leaders promised a warmer tone for the presidential visit and asked volunteers and police to keep the sidewalks calm. Still, flyers with cruel language would appear on the morning of the event, and an ad in a major paper used sharp accusations to stir attention. Those pieces did not write the day, but they showed a house divided over the president and over the pace of change. The advance team kept to the schedule and trusted that many proud citizens would outweigh the few who liked to provoke. The JFK assassination would later chain memory to names of buildings and corners. Yet in the planning, the names were just waypoints on a file. Love Field looked like an easy arrival with space for a moderate crowd and with fast access to the main roads. The Trade Mart offered banquet halls and bright lights for cameras, and leaders liked the message that business thrived in the city. Between them sat the maze of central streets that had grown around the rail lines and the old river bends. The map was not drawn to tempt a crime, yet the design included a triple underpass and a slope that gathered roads into a knot. Advance men walked Main Street and asked about construction and permits that might block a lane. They spoke with the chief of police and the sheriff and assigned motorcycles at intervals that seemed standard for a friendly crowd. Windows along the way were counted and noted in sketches, yet no one ordered a search or a seal because that practice was not the norm. Rooftops were left to workers and pigeons, and overpasses would hold clusters of waving families. Agents marked places where turns would tighten and where the lead car would signal a brief slowdown. The talk focused on blocking side streets and timing lights so that the line never broke apart. The plan also carried the showpiece of seating that would place the President and First Lady in a clear view, with the governor and his wife in front in the same car. The Vice President would ride behind in another vehicle with his own agents and staff. That order aimed at harmony, and it made for a strong picture at turns and at straightaways. Photographers wanted the faces to stack in one frame, and aides seemed glad to grant that wish. Other cars would hold the press pool and local officials, and a bus would trail the group. Every detail promised good coverage and a warm line of sight to voters who were still making up their minds. Fundraising remained a quiet purpose for the visit, and that need shaped the guest list and the trade group that hosted the lunch. Tickets moved quickly among business owners and civic clubs who wanted a chance to shake hands and to hear a short talk about prosperity and unity. The White House believed that a successful day in Dallas would raise not only money, but also a picture of strength in a state that loomed large in the electoral vote. That confidence helped lock the schedule, even as some friends urged caution about the mood of a few loud groups. City hosts promised courtesy patrols and quick response to any hecklers, and organizers pressed forward. The JFK assassination would later turn every small choice into a point of study. Yet in the moment, those choices felt ordinary and well-tested. Routes had passed beneath high windows in many cities without trouble, and open cars had rolled past cheering families for years. Aides trusted that local officers would note any odd scene in time to act. Agents listened to those officers and kept their own eyes open, and they had trained to move fast if a threat appeared close to the curb. The blind spots lay in distance and angle, and those blind spots would be learned the hard way. The President enjoyed the energy of crowds and read them as a measure of health for the office and the country. He liked unscripted moments and quick stops, and staff planned room for that style. Security tried to build steady habits while still leaving space for contact. That balance had held in city after city, and each safe visit reinforced the same choice the next time. In the planning rooms for Dallas, the mood mixed calm with calculation. Opposition groups prepared signs and letters and organized small protests that would not interrupt the motorcade but would aim to frame the message on the air. Supporters planned their own banners and arranged for school bands to line some blocks. Church leaders asked congregations to be courteous, and civic groups offered volunteer ushers to guide early arrivals into the luncheon hall. City maintenance crews swept gutters and checked traffic signals that had failed the week before. Hotels filled with traveling staff, reporters, and donors who compared notes in lobbies late into the night. The JFK assassination was not yet a phrase in the air, so the team slept with a normal mix of nerves and hope that comes before a high-profile day. Some expected a few harsh signs and a few loud shouts, and most expected friendly waves on the long straightaways. Local police set early calls for officers and placed motorcycles with care to avoid gaps. A radio plan linked city units with the lead car and promised quick notice of any delay. The rooms for the luncheon were dressed with flags and flowers, and name cards went down in neat rows. On the morning route map, one small park sat as a pause between tall buildings and the sweep of the highway, and no one marked it as more than a pleasant bend. In the file, the turn looked like a flourish that would slow the car for the last blocks before the luncheon. Engineers had shaped the roads to feed traffic into 3 lines that dove beneath rail beds and then fanned out toward the west. That design served commuters and freight, and it would soon matter for reasons no one in the planning rooms had voiced. The alias many would later use, the Dallas motorcade shooting, had not been coined. By dawn, the plan stood firm, and Dallas waited for the arrival calmly. On the morning of November 22nd, the JFK assassination was still unimaginable as the president woke in Fort Worth to light rain and early cheers. The Hotel Texas rose from quiet streets, windows aglow, while agents checked sidewalks and loading bays. Overnight showers left puddles that caught neon reflections and cooled the air. Before breakfast, people gathered under awnings, hats tilted, hoping for a glimpse. Inside, staff reviewed the schedule and watched the weather ease. A short speech to local leaders would be followed by a flight to Dallas and a luncheon downtown. The mood was busy and calm. Security moved with practiced routines, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning doors. It felt like a normal campaign-style morning shaped by crowd energy and steady anticipation. Before sunrise, the rain softened, and by breakfast, the ballroom buzzed with local officials, spouses, and workers who had waited for weeks. The president offered brisk remarks about defense jobs, space ambitions, and Texas growth. He joked about the weather and smiled at the crowd. Outside, hundreds more stood in the drizzle and asked to see him as well. He stepped to a platform and gave a few friendly words without notes. Reporters scribbled and passed lines to radio desks. The First Lady appeared to warm applause, her suit bright against the gray. Agents stayed near but allowed a close view. People lifted children to their shoulders. The feeling of welcome folded into the schedule and kept the day moving forward with relaxed smiles around. After breakfast, the party moved through polished corridors to waiting cars. The motorcade to the airbase took only a short while, escorted by motorcycles and unmarked sedans. On the tarmac, the presidential aircraft gleamed under a thinning sky. Luggage was stowed quickly. The couple climbed the stairs and waved to a pocket of onlookers gathered beyond a rope line. Engines spooled to life and conversation thinned to hand signals and nods. The hop to Dallas would be brief. Staff reviewed seating and remarks for the luncheon. Aides compared notes on who had greeted whom in Fort Worth. The short flight gave space to breathe and to reset. It felt like a clean handoff from one friendly city to another under a clearing late sun. The wheels touched down in late morning and the stairs rolled into place. At Love Field, families pressed against fences and waved small flags as the couple came into view. A local delegation formed a receiving line with handshakes and quick greetings. A bouquet of red roses found the First Lady's hands, a detail that would later sit heavy in memories shaped by the JFK assassination. Photographers clustered near the wing and shouted for a look. The air had turned clear and soft, so the bubble top stayed off. Agents kept a loose ring as the couple walked along the rope line and met people face to face. The pace was unhurried. It felt like any warm arrival in a proud American city that day. The limousine waited with doors open and seats set for the planned picture. The governor and his wife took their places on the jump seats. The president and first lady settled behind them. The follow car idled close with agents ready to stand if needed. Motorcycle officers checked radios and visors and glanced at the sky. The air felt good for an open ride. Local police controlled the gate and released the motorcade onto city streets. The first blocks moved slowly as people crowded the curbs. You could see office workers leaning from windows with careful balance. Children pointed and waved. The scene matched countless motorcades from other cities. It felt safe because it had worked many times, and habit carried the moment for many. The first minutes after the airport carried a holiday rhythm as blocks filled with sound and camera clicks. The president turned to acknowledge both sides while the governor pointed out landmarks. Agents in the follow car watched hands reach toward the open car and then withdraw. They looked for quick movement and for faces that seemed focused on more than a wave. At this stage, no one thought in terms of the JFK assassination, and the habits of greeting ran the show. The motorcade settled into a steady speed and met cross streets that had been held for a clear path. Along one stretch, school children lined the walk with paper flags. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and new winter coats in the bright sun. Coordination between the protective team and city officers worked through practiced cues and plain speech. The lead car called small adjustments, and motorcycles tightened or widened the flank. A few agents glanced up at tall windows as a habit. Most attention stayed at street level where contact was closest. Aides in the press car pointed out the strong turnout and passed updates along. The radio chatter remained calm. The plan allowed for brief pauses if clusters grew too tight. In those pauses, the president lifted his hand and smiled while the First Lady met eyes along the curb. It was a ritual of American public life. People wished good health and safe travels. Those wishes threaded the late morning as the city opened its arms. Along the main stretches, people filmed with home cameras and tried to keep a steady frame. Others snapped still photos and tucked the prints into wallets later. Office clerks leaned on windowsills with careful smiles. A shoe shiner paused and lifted his rag to wave. A mother balanced a toddler on her hip and said the child would remember. The city's afternoon waited behind all of this. Yet for a while, time slowed to a parade pace. No one watching imagined how the footage would be studied after the JFK assassination. They only wanted to mark the moment. Traffic on parallel streets crawled as drivers craned for a look. Horns gave soft taps, and strangers spoke to one another without hurry in that light. The approach toward the heart of downtown brought more shade and taller facades. The turns grew tighter, and the speed dropped through natural bends in the streets. The route had been chosen to showcase the center and to guide the cars toward a luncheon hall on the far side. Police blocked side roads and held pedestrians at corners until the line passed. Some windows were open for fresh air, and a few workers looked out with coffee cups in hand. The name that would later attach to this moment, the Dallas motorcade shooting, did not exist in anyone's mind. Clerks checked watches and calculated whether they could still make a sandwich before the guests spoke. The system still felt routine, orderly, and welcoming to all. In the car, the talk stayed light. The governor pointed to new buildings and spoke about contracts and schools. The president asked about turnout in smaller counties and laughed at a street sign that matched a friend's name. The First Lady adjusted the roses on her lap and glanced at the crowd with a practiced smile. Leather squeaked softly as the car eased around corners. Sun flickered across faces as blocks opened and closed. The calm before the shock held for a few more minutes that felt ordinary. No one in the limousine framed these minutes against the JFK assassination. They lived them as part of a moving day that began with rain and turned bright. The city looked clear and kind to them both. Behind the main vehicles, the press pool kept its own rhythm. Photographers reloaded film and checked exposure through handheld meters. A radio reporter rehearsed a sentence he hoped would fit the mood of the day. Producers at stations across the city prepared to break into regular programs with quick updates. Television trucks planned to catch the luncheon speeches and then package the motorcade scenes for the evening broadcasts. The pace of news still had natural pauses. That gave editors time to write and to confirm. The crowd understood this and waved at the pool car as if saluting the path into the air. The small industry around a visit ran smoothly. It had rules, habits, and expectations that kept surprises rare on most days anywhere. The sky brightened as the cars neared a stretch where downtown opened to a patch of blue. Earlier, talk about a roof had faded the moment the sun returned. Clear views helped crowds feel included and helped photographers document the visit. Safety measures were shaped by that culture. Agents guarded the perimeter and managed the space along the curb. They were not equipped to seal the world above. The city had not planned for that either. People accepted the trade as part of public life. The JFK assassination would later recast that balance and bring new habits into law and practice. On this morning, the old habits held. The open ride felt like the right choice for a day of welcome in bright late sun. As noon approached, the sound of sirens mixed with the echo of tires on concrete. The building seemed to lean closer and then fall away as the street curved. Streetlights wore garlands for the season, and shop windows showed winter displays. A train horn sounded from a yard beyond the center. The crowd thinned for a block, and then thickened again near a corner where shade offered relief. The president touched his hair and looked toward a new cluster of faces. The First Lady adjusted her gloves and kept her smile. The memory that would become the story of the JFK assassination waited ahead on the route. Unseen, the moment here still held. The city poured out another wave of applause in the clear air. The motorcade eased toward a final set of turns that would send the line toward a small park and the highway beyond. A breeze carried the smell of cut grass and the faint creak of signs on wires. The talk inside the cars narrowed to simple remarks about time and the luncheon program. The governor leaned back slightly and pointed to a building he wanted noted for later. The First Lady's roses rested in her lap. The city, eager and proud, leaned in again. No one placed these minutes inside the frame of the JFK assassination. They lived them as a passage between welcome and work. The engines hummed, the motorcycles kept order, and the day held its breath as the cars rolled forward together. In Dealey Plaza, the JFK assassination moved from possibility no one held to a shock that fixed the midday in memory. The motorcade swept past the last tall buildings and curved toward a small park that fell away to the railroad yards. Flags hung from light poles and the air felt clear. People stood on curbs with cameras and children. The convertible eased down the slope as the crowd thinned and sunlight widened. The chief of the lead car watched the spacing. Motorcycles drifted to new positions as the lane narrowed. On a wall, a handful of spectators balanced on toes. A man steadied a movie camera and tried to keep a frame. Another man raised a still camera and blinked through the viewfinder. The noise of the city softened to tires on concrete. A dress fluttered nearby. Faces tipped upward. The hands in the car lifted to greet kindly. At the turn onto Elm, the slope grew steeper and the buildings fell behind. The limousine rolled close to a brown brick warehouse that faced the park with long rows of windows. The crowd on the south side pulled back slightly where the curb gave way to grass. Families pressed to the edge to keep the view. The lead car cleared the bend and steadied the pace. In the press, car reporters jotted quick lines about the friendly turnout. A few looked up and took in the curve and the railroad bridge ahead. The sound of the motorcycles bounced off concrete. The open space changed the acoustics and gave the plaza a hollow feel. The air held sun and a faint smell of oil from the street. A slow ride through a bright noon felt like a promise. No one knew how quickly the promise would break in this place. In that open bowl, the first sharp report cut across the plaza, and the motorcade stiffened. Many heard it as a backfire and looked for a truck. Others heard it as a crack that did not fit the traffic around them. The lead car pushed ahead while the limousine paused a fraction on the gentle curve. The governor began to turn. The First Lady leaned slightly toward him. An agent rose in the follow car and scanned the rear of the crowd. Witnesses pointed in different directions as echoes rolled under the bridge and along the buildings. The sight line changed with every step and with every flinch. The moment that would anchor the JFK assassination had begun. Cameras that were rolling caught faces reacting and hands lifting. Officers on motorcycles lifted their eyes from the curb line. The plaza filled with sound and questions and a strike of fear. A second report followed close enough to blur with the first in memory, and the car lurched forward. Birds rose from trees near the tracks. Some spectators dropped flat on the grass while others stood frozen with mouths open. The governor pulled tight and grimaced. The First Lady reached toward him as instinct pulled her forward. The driver looked back for half a beat and then faced the road. An agent leaped from the follow car and began to run along the left side of the limousine. Officers shouted to clear the field. A child cried out and clung to a mother's dress. The sound seemed to come from high and from near at once. The plaza became a chamber of echoes that hid the source. The chain of moments that framed the JFK assassination kept tightening as the motorcade gathered speed. People prayed, ducked, and searched the windows above. A third crack rolled across the plaza, and the agent reached the rear step and pulled himself up. He threw his body across the back to shield the figures inside. The driver pressed the pedal, and the limousine surged. The follow car leaned forward with siren opening a path. People on the grass covered their heads. Others ran toward the low wall and lay flat. An officer ran up the slope toward the tracks. Another officer rushed toward the knoll where a white fence met the trees. Bystanders shouted different directions and pointed with shaking hands. The echo made every call feel true. The bridge ahead opened like a mouth, and the cars rushed through its shade. The JFK assassination had become a flight to help. The limousine climbed the rise beyond the bridge and aimed for the hospital that waited to the west. Sirens wailed and radios crackled hard. Back in the plaza, the sudden silence after the roar felt unreal. People stood up slowly and looked at each other as if asking permission to breathe. Some ran toward the low hill where a fence cut across the top. Others ran toward the brick warehouse with its square windows open to the noon. Officers split without waiting for orders. A few crossed the street and entered the ground floor of the warehouse. Another group spread along the picket fence and peered into the weeds behind it. A man held his hat with both hands and said he had heard shots from up the slope. A woman wept near the curb. A newsman pushed his camera to his eye and tried to focus. The phrase "Dallas motorcade shooting" would come later. In the moment, no one named the terror. They only moved, listened, shouted, and tried to help and comforted. Police reached the warehouse steps and pushed through the doors with weapons drawn low. Workers pointed toward the stairs and an elevator that moved slowly between floors. A witness from the plaza told an officer he had seen a man at an upper window with a long object. The tip had seemed to withdraw after the noise. Officers began to climb. The building smelled of paper and glue and dust. Each landing echoed with leather soles and short commands. On the street, other officers scanned the windows for movement. A radio call asked for rifles and more men. The JFK assassination had turned the ordinary building into a place of urgent questions. Inside, a few employees stood by walls with hands visible. Others waited near the door and tried to help. The search moved floor by floor while the noise outside rose and fell with rumor and drawers opening nearby. Across the grass, the search along the fence turned up only footprints and cigarette butts and a few startled workers. Railroad men waved officers toward boxcars and ladders. They had heard the cracks and felt sure the sound came from the yard. Others swore the sound came from the windows behind the motorcade. One man pointed to the underpass and said the noise had rolled from beneath the bridge. The plaza played tricks on the ear and made certainty rare. People crouched behind stone planters and waited for a direction that did not come. A woman comforted a child and said help was on the way. The JFK assassination had fractured a simple lunch hour and left strangers guiding strangers. An officer climbed a small embankment and looked across a fan of tracks. A whistle blew somewhere beyond, and the echo made the search stretch wider through warm, midday glare. Near the pedestal by the curve, a bystander with a home camera kept the lens steady even as his hands shook. He could not know how long those frames would echo. Another bystander with a still camera swept the scene in short bursts. A motorcycle officer parked hard and ran toward the grass. Across the street, a man at the curb touched his cheek and saw it marked by flying debris. He stared at the underpass and tried to make sense of angles and sound. On the warehouse steps, an officer held the door while others moved inside. A deputy scanned the rooftop lines and spoke into a radio that clicked and faded. The JFK assassination turned the plaza into a confused set of lines that crossed at once. Witnesses tried to describe what they had heard. Their words clashed. The recordings would carry that clash for years and memory. Beyond the underpass, the limousine gathered speed with the agent braced against the wind. The driver headed for the nearest hospital and left the rest of the motorcade to follow as best they could. A pilot car swung wide to block traffic at the merge. Sirens opened gaps through packed lanes. Back in the plaza, officers tried to form a line and hold back the crowd. Others continued the search behind the fence and into the yard. Reporters asked for statements and found only confusion and tears. Radios called for doctors and for control of the warehouse. The scene kept pulling between chase and search. The JFK assassination had split the morning into two tasks. One path raced west. One path dug for answers where the noise had begun. The air at the curve felt empty, and the smell of gasoline lingered on the slope and on the stunned crowd. Inside the warehouse, the search tightened around a set of boxes near a corner window. Officers marked the spot and called for supervisors. On a nearby floor, someone found spent shells on the wood. Another office found a torn paper bag. A supervisor began to list names of workers who were missing from the roll at lunch. The elevator creaked and then stopped on a landing. Men shouted for it to be held. The building breathed with the noise of many feet. Outside, squad cars pulled to the curb and men with shotguns stepped out. The plaza had become a staging ground for a case that felt both sudden and endless. The JFK assassination pushed routine work into crisis work. Telephones rang in newsrooms and at the police headquarters. Families turned on televisions and heard the first sketchy lines of what had taken place and prayed for steady hands everywhere. In less than a minute, the plaza had changed from a backdrop for civic pride to a ground of shock and duty. People who had come for a glance found themselves directing strangers and waving officers toward likely paths. On the grass, a woman picked up a glove and stared at it as if it could speak. A man held a child and told him to look at the sky. Sirens kept tearing the air beyond the bridge. A reporter asked a witness to repeat his account and wrote each word with care. The city would know soon enough what had happened. The nation would hear before the hour had fully turned. The JFK assassination had moved on to rooms where doctors worked and where phones kept ringing. The plaza settled into quiet orders and taped corners. The road ahead ran toward help and toward a harder kind of afternoon. At Parkland Hospital, in the first urgent minutes after the JFK assassination, the limousine slid to a stop at the emergency bay, and hands reached for the wounded. Agents opened doors and shouted for help while nurses cleared a path with brisk calm. The stretcher clattered over thresholds and into bright light. Doctors hurried from nearby rooms and asked fast questions that carried both training and shock. A priest was called without delay. The First Lady stepped back only when asked and kept her eyes on the gurney. In that hallway, time felt narrow and loud. Radios cracked and then went quiet. The city held its breath while the hospital moved with practiced intention. The work began with a simple rule that every second matters. In Trauma Room 1, the attempt to save a life took shape in a flurry of efforts. Lab coats and suits crowded near the table, and then gave space as orders set a rhythm. The wound patterns were not the focus of public words that day. The work focused on airway and pulse, and any sign that a path back remained. Senior surgeons made decisions that they wished were not needed. Nurses passed instruments with steady hands grown from long days in emergency care. The First Lady stood nearby until moved aside. An agent stayed by the door to hold the space. Outside the room, a knot of reporters tried to read faces and could not. Across the parking lot, sirens delivered other vehicles from the motorcade. The governor was rushed to another trauma room with his wife at his side. Surgeons split between the cases and tried to keep the two tracks clear. Officers formed a perimeter and worked to keep the hallway from filling beyond control. A local priest reached the room and offered quiet words that met the shape of the moment. A call went to Washington as aides sought guidance for a day that had lost its map. Television studios interrupted regular shows with bulletins that still used cautious language. The Dallas motorcade shooting had entered the national vocabulary at speed. Families turned up the volume and listened for certainty that did not come. Inside the room, the rhythm of care drove out almost everything else. Doctors watched monitors and then looked to the patient for signs that screens cannot give. Voices dropped to short replies. Someone fetched blood. Someone checked for equipment that might help. The sound of shoes on tile marked small shifts in position. A clock on the wall kept true time while the room moved through a different kind. The First Lady stood with gloved hands folded. An agent brought a chair and she waved it away. The pledge to do everything possible held firm until the facts left no choice. The moment of pronouncement came without ceremony and settled into the bones of everyone present. The time was 1 o'clock in Dallas. Word traveled out in pieces before it became official. The press room swelled and then fell quiet as a doctor stepped to the microphones. The language was spare and careful. Reporters wrote each syllable as if the act could hold the hour still. In homes and offices across the country, people reached for telephones. At the hospital, the First Lady was guided to a small room to collect herself. She asked for time with her husband and remained with him. Agents spoke in low tones at the door and refused entry to anyone without clear purpose. The shock inside Parkland rolled like a tide and then grew still. The next task began as the gravity of succession pushed into view. The JFK assassination required a transfer of power that could not wait for ceremonies. The vice president had reached Parkland and was kept under guard in a room set aside by hospital staff. He had been urged to go to the airport but stayed until the word was beyond dispute. Agents weighed risk in every corridor and urged movement. The vice president spoke with aides and with local officials. He chose to leave only after he was sure the First Lady would not be left alone, and the body would be escorted with care. That balance between respect and security would drive the next hours. The chain of continuity mattered, and so did the dignity of grief. The halls saw a tense exchange over medical jurisdiction and the custody of the body. Dallas officials believed an autopsy should take place in the county. Federal agents believed the president must return to Washington under protection, and that the examination could occur there. The medical examiner argued his duty. The agent cited the need to move with speed and to guard the line of succession. A casket was brought and placed on a rolling bier. The First Lady stood by it and would not leave. Nurses closed the door while the discussion went on. The decision was made in action rather than in votes. The casket moved toward the exit. Officers cleared a path in stages through a hallway lined with faces. At Love Field, the presidential aircraft waited under a bright sky that had forgotten the morning rain. News had reached the tarmac in a flood, and crews stood with caps in hand as the motorcade arrived. The casket was lifted carefully and carried up the narrow stairs with agents bearing the weight. The First Lady followed close, her suit marked by the hours. Members of the press watched in silence and wrote details they wished had never come to them. The Vice President boarded and moved to a small compartment to confer with aides. The cabin filled with hushed voices and the soft hiss of conditioned air. The door closed against the noise of the field, and the aircraft became the stage for the next act. The question of where to take the oath found its answer in the narrow galley between compartments. A federal judge was summoned from the city and driven to the plane at speed. A small Bible or a Catholic missal was sought in the cabin. Sworn officers checked the corridor and posted themselves at both ends. The First Lady chose to stand beside the new president when the words were read. The oath was given with simple gravity. The new president repeated each line in a clear voice that carried the weight of duty and shock. Photographs would later show a crowded space and faces turned toward the words. In that tight room, the Republic proved its habit of order, even on a day that felt broken. The JFK assassination altered the role of everyone on that aircraft in a single afternoon. The new president asked that the body be flown to Washington at once. The crew prepared for departure while the judge stepped off the plane, and the field officers cleared a path. The press pool was told to take assigned seats. Agents checked latches and curtains and stowed bags that had been left in earlier haste. The engines began to turn, and the cabin filled with the steady note that marks the start of travel. The First Lady sat near the casket and rested one hand on its polished surface. Aide after aide came to offer quiet words and then stepped back. The plane rolled and lifted into a sun that seemed colder than it had an hour before. Back in the hospital, the governor remained in surgery with a skilled team at work. His wife waited with family close by. Local officials tried to manage the press without clear lines to the national centers of authority. Reporters filed bulletins from payphones and from small desks in the press room. A priest visited again to offer comfort. The hospital floors creaked under the weight of long strides. The corridors smelled of coffee and antiseptic and the faint scent of flowers from a gift shop that had closed early. Volunteers brought water to officers who had not left their posts. The city began to change its afternoon plans while trying to hold normal life together. Classes let out early. Offices closed. People went home to sit by radios and screens. In Washington, the cabinet and congressional leaders were notified and began to gather in secure rooms. The military checked readiness levels as a precaution. Foreign capitals sent messages of sorrow and shock. Embassy lines in the United States rang without pause. The White House press office wrote a few sentences and then rewrote them to match the hour. The resident staff prepared rooms for the return. The East Room would soon carry a different silence than it had known for many years. The nation had moved through the gates of continuity, yet still felt adrift. The ritual tasks waited to be named and begun. The lines of the Constitution were alive in every mind that day, even when they were not spoken aloud. As the aircraft crossed state lines, the cabin moved between quiet and purposeful motion. The new president spoke with staff about the immediate steps that would meet the needs of the night and the next day. Calls went to leaders in both parties. Aides drafted notes to heads of state. A press secretary prepared the briefest remarks for arrival. The First Lady remained by the casket and did not change. She told those around her that the nation should see what it had lost and should understand the cost without vivid words. The mood set by her presence shaped the tone of the return. It favored restraint and the simple dignity of staying near the one who had been lost. On the ground in Dallas, detectives and federal agents deepened the first loops of a case that was widening by the minute. Witnesses from the plaza were brought to give statements. Police secured the warehouse and began a slower search now that the chase had shifted outward. The radio carried news of a suspect who had been questioned and would be moved. The community felt the snap of rumor and then the weight of official words. The first day of the investigation was born in the same hours that carried grief through the city. The beat of practical duty kept time with a different human time. Both would continue for months and years as the country tried to explain a day that had slipped beyond explanation. The JFK assassination reached Washington with solemn order, and the night opened to examination, ritual, and first explanations. In the hours after the JFK assassination, the search for a suspect crossed streets and rooms that Lee Harvey Oswald knew well. He had worked quietly at the warehouse on the plaza and rented a small room in Oak Cliff under simple terms. He moved between those places with habits that looked ordinary from a distance. Months before, he had drifted between jobs and ideas and spent weekends at a friendly home in the nearby suburb. His marriage carried strain that friends tried to ease. He was 24, restless, and certain that history noticed him even when few neighbors did. On the morning before the motorcade, he rode into Dallas with a co-worker who lived near the family that sometimes hosted him. The package he carried drew a casual question and an easy answer about curtain rods. The co-worker thought little of it and drove on. At work, he blended into the routine with a sandwich and a small talk rhythm that did not stand out. He kept to himself and watched the clock. The plans for lunch at the Trade Mart sat far from his desk. The building carried its own hum that hid a private timetable no one else knew. When the shots rang out, he left the warehouse floor and headed down the stairs with others who were confused by the strange sound. A supervisor saw him calm and breathing evenly as he asked for a soda. Moments later, he slipped into the city that spun around the news. On the street, he tried a bus that inched through traffic, then chose a taxi cab when the delay felt risky. He gave an address near his rooming house and asked the driver to pass it by. He walked the last blocks alone, moving at a pace that matched his private alarm. At the rooming house, he stepped inside for only a minute and changed his jacket. The housekeeper saw him go with a quick word that sounded like a routine errand. A patrol car cruised nearby as the city shifted from welcome to shock. He set off again along quiet residential streets lined with bare trees. The news had not yet reached every porch. Radios were just warming to the bulletins that would soon fill the air. He kept moving without a clear destination that others could see. His plan adjusted to each corner and to each sight of a uniform. On a side street, a patrolman drew near, working a pattern of checks called in by radio as descriptions grew from the plaza. The officer pulled alongside and spoke a brief question through the window. A second sentence followed, and the man by the curb approached. What happened next took seconds and left the officer on the pavement while neighbors cried out. The man ran, tossed a jacket behind a car, and cut through yards toward Jefferson Boulevard. Sirens began to crowd the blocks as witnesses pointed in haste. The city now chased a moving figure while the timeline kept narrowing. On Jefferson, a shoe store manager watched a man slip into a darkened movie house without stopping at the ticket window. The manager followed and told the clerk, who called police from a nearby business. Inside, the theater was nearly empty in the early afternoon, and the screen lit the rows with a weak glow. A few patrons sat scattered and still. The man moved from seat to seat as if trying to become smaller. The clerk stood by the sidewalk and looked down the street for a cruiser. The call spread across channels and cars swung toward the block. Officers entered through the front and the rear and let their eyes adjust. The manager pointed toward the left section and whispered a seat number. An officer walked the aisle quietly while others paused near the exits. The man looked straight ahead and then turned his head slightly. A hand touched his shoulder and he rose fast. In the struggle, a gun appeared and pressed hard against a blue uniform. The click of metal answered pressure and hands reached in at once. The gun was wrestled free and the crowd of officers closed tight. The man shouted words about rights and protest. They led him up the aisle while a few patrons sat stunned and silent. On the sidewalk, reporters and neighbors pressed toward the doors and asked for a name. He gave one and then another. The patrol car took him away as officers shielded the windows with broad shoulders. Back inside, the staff tried to return to calm, though the screen kept playing to an audience that no longer watched. The ticket taker stood with the manager and let the relief come slowly. The afternoon had changed the room. The city had found a suspect in a place built for quiet. At headquarters, officials began to map his recent years in broad strokes while interviews unfolded. He had served in the Marines, learned new skills, and later traveled to the Soviet Union. He had returned to the United States with a young family and a restless sense of purpose. Odd jobs followed, and political pamphlets appeared in his hands in several cities. Friends described a man who argued often and closed off quickly. He spoke about Cuba and about injustice. He rented cheap rooms and took buses that crossed long distances. His path wound through places that left few steady ties behind. In the weeks before the motorcade, he stayed part-time at a modest suburban house where a friend helped his wife and children. He kept some belongings there and visited on Fridays after a ride from a co-worker. The job at the book warehouse had come through local contacts. It paid little but offered steady hours before the holidays. Investigators learned about a rifle purchased by mail under a different name. They heard about photographs and about a backyard pose. They added a revolver to the list and noted serial numbers. Each piece would be tested against the day's events. Inside the station, the interview room filled and emptied as detectives, federal agents, and local officials took turns. He asked for counsel and complained about rough handling. He denied every charge that reached his ear. He said he had eaten lunch alone on a lower floor. He said he had left the building because crowds would cause trouble for buses. He heard the name of the fallen officer and said he did not know the man. He said he had carried only a paper bag with personal items. He called himself a patsy. The clock pushed forward while statements took shape. Evidence grew by the hour as teams compared notes from the plaza and the theater. Shells were logged from a high floor in the warehouse, and a rifle was found nearby. Fingerprints and palm prints were lifted where possible. Witnesses described a man with a long package on a recent morning and repeated a comment about curtain rods. Others saw a figure at an upper window. The bus driver who took him a short distance wrote a report. The taxi driver remembered the request to pass a house by and stop farther along. Threads began to bind into a rough picture. Outside the station, the press multiplied as each hour passed. Reporters crowded the hallway and tried to hear fragments as doors opened and closed. Television crews set up lights and waited for a chance to film the transfer to the county jail. The nation watched the station steps and the brief walk down a ramp for a lineup. The words, JFK Assassination, now filled every bulletin and kept people near their screens. The city police planned a careful move. Officers checked routes and elevators and looked for places where crowds might surge. The building had not been designed for such attention. Meanwhile, the block where the patrolman fell drew neighbors with flowers and quiet talk. Investigators marked shell casings and took careful notes. Families stood back from the tape and spoke in low tones about the quick turn their day had taken. Radios brought them the same updates as everyone else. At the station, the suspect was booked, photographed, and examined by a doctor for bruises from the struggle. He was allowed a phone call that did not reach anyone who could help. Food and coffee were offered. He kept demanding counsel and kept refusing details. The interviewers returned and pressed again. The legal system in that city did not move as fast as national attention. Arrangements for counsel took time and were complicated by the hour and by the crowd outside. Local leaders called judges and defense lawyers to ask who could step in. The case expanded by the minute, and now spanned 2 deaths and an attack at a theater. The pace inside the station was careful and slow. Detectives typed statements and checked small facts with phone calls. The chain of custody for each item was noted. The rhythm of routine tried to keep shape under a pressure no one had known. As evening came, the plan formed to move the prisoner to the county jail when paperwork and schedules allowed. The route would be short, but the interest around it was large. Officers inspected the basement and the ramps and thought about cameras and lights. The chief answered questions and asked for patience. The man in custody continued to deny each charge and asked again for a lawyer. He heard that the president had died after the midday attack and showed little change in face or tone. The words around him kept circling the same point. The weekend had just begun. By night, the path from the warehouse to the Texas Theater had become a thread many hands would follow after the JFK assassination. The same blocks would be walked again in reports that tried to place intention beside chance within the shadow of the JFK assassination. Ordinary places like buses, rooms, and a quiet theater seat were fixed to a date that kept echoing as the JFK assassination settled into public memory. What followed would test order, grief, and the limits of safety together. In the first full hours after the JFK assassination, a weekend unfolded that joined shock, ritual, and a second sudden crime captured on live television. Newsrooms shifted into continuous coverage and pressed microphones against every official door. Families gathered around sets and watched anchors speak with careful calm. The Capitol prepared rooms for mourning while Dallas police managed a crush of reporters. The suspect sat in small interview rooms and asked for a lawyer. The nation felt numb and could not look away. Ordinary plans for sports, church, and errands bent under the weight of the day. At police headquarters, the building filled with voices and flashing bulbs as Friday turned to night. Detectives and federal agents took turns in the interview room and kept notes by hand. There were no recordings to capture the exchanges, only pages that would later be typed and signed. The man under arrest denied every charge and asked again for counsel. He named a lawyer in another city and said he had little money. Outside the door, officers pushed back cameras and tried to keep the hall clear. The mood mixed fatigue, haste, and a stubborn sense of order. Across the networks, anchors settled into long hours that would run without commercials. A familiar voice removed his glasses as he read the first confirmation that the president had died. Entertainment programs vanished from the schedule. Stations broadcast simple music between bulletins when the studio needed a pause. Local affiliates sent crews to churches and city halls where candles began to appear. Broadcasters learned how to fill silence with steady information and human restraint. The country learned how television could hold a vigil. The JFK assassination turned living rooms into quiet public squares linked by wire and light. That night in Washington, the casket rested in the East Room while military guards kept watch. The First Lady remained close and spoke softly with family and staff about the mourning. She asked for dignity and for a procession that would echo a long American tradition. Planners worked through the dark to arrange a path from the White House to the Capitol. Florists arrived with wreaths. Clergy prepared prayers. The city that handled ceremony began to bend around private loss and public duty. The assassination of President Kennedy turned ritual tasks into acts of national care. Back in Dallas, the suspect faced a midnight press showing in the bright bulbs of a crowded basement. Reporters shouted questions, and he said he was a patsy. He denied shooting anyone and demanded a lawyer again. He was charged in the killing of a patrolman and then in the murder of the president. Lineups brought witnesses behind glass while officers kept the corridor packed and tense. The building was not designed for such attention. Each step drew shoves and flash bursts. The JFK assassination had turned a city headquarters into a national stage. Saturday brought a quiet kind of movement across the country as churches opened and people slipped into pews. Towns lowered flags and placed black cloth on civic doors. College games were postponed in many places, and marching bands put away their uniforms. One professional league decided to play, and that choice drew regret and debate. Another league paused entirely. The schedules felt small beside the grief, yet still touched daily rhythms that people knew by heart. Families drove without radio music and spoke in low voices. The JFK assassination entered homes like a solemn guest who would not leave soon. At the White House Saturday, dignitaries arrived in a steady stream and paid respects in rooms that felt both grand and close. Friends stayed near the children and tried to keep the day gentle. Staff placed toys in a quiet corner and kept schedules light. The First Lady met clergy and military planners and spoke about a funeral that would honor history. Lines began to form outside even before the public was invited to view. The city absorbed the weight with a kind of practiced tenderness. The JFK assassination had turned Washington into a house of mourning. Saturday night in Dallas, the plan took shape to move the prisoner to the county jail on Sunday morning. Officers walked the basement and checked ramps and rails. They discussed cameras, ropes, and the route the car would follow. News crews made their own plans and positioned lights for a live broadcast. The suspect slept only a little while and woke to more questions. He asked again for counsel and said little more. The building sat inside a city that had not slept. The JFK assassination kept the lights on and kept tempers thin and attention scattered. Sunday morning in Washington opened with movement that felt both solemn and exact. A caisson waited at the north portico and soldiers stood at attention along the drive. The casket was borne with care, and the First Lady walked beside it in measured steps. The procession moved through quiet streets toward the Capitol where the public would file past in long lines. People arrived from nearby towns and stood for hours. The rotunda received them with a stillness that deepened as the day went on. The JFK assassination gave the city a steady river of footsteps and tears. Back in Dallas, late Sunday morning, officers prepared the basement for the transfer that would take only a minute. A car backed toward the ramp, and a second waited beyond the street. Reporters crowded behind rails with cameras aimed at a spot where the prisoner would appear. A live television camera stood ready. The prisoner was led from an elevator in a dark sweater and moved between detectives. He shielded his eyes from the lamps. A reporter asked a question that hung in the air. A man stepped from the crowd with a revolver in his hand and fired once. The picture shook, and voices rose as the scene turned in an instant. A broadcaster blurted that the prisoner had been shot. Officers swarmed the gunman and drove him against a car, while others lifted the fallen man from the floor. The camera caught a blur of hats, hands, and faces. Viewers at home cried out in disbelief and reached for the nearest person. An ambulance backed into the ramp and carried the wounded man to the same hospital that had worked so hard on Friday. Doctors tried again and could not undo the damage. He died just after 1 o'clock. Within minutes, the gunman had a name that many officers already knew. He ran a nightclub and was a familiar figure around the station. He said he acted from anger and to spare the First Lady the pain of a public trial. Detectives read him his rights and booked him for murder. Reporters rewound the tape again and again to make sense of what they had seen. The image of a shooting on live television would not fade. The JFK assassination now carried a second death that deepened doubt and grief at once. As the day went on, the line at the Capitol stretched into the night. People stood with children wrapped in coats and moved in small steps toward the rotunda. A hush held inside the chamber that no one had to enforce. Foreign leaders sent messages and prepared to travel. Allies pledged respect and attendance at the funeral. The capital became a meeting place for sorrow that crossed borders and languages. The city's lights reflected on damp streets, and the sound of shoes never stopped. The JFK assassination had gathered the world for a vigil in the heart of Washington. Television learned new rules that weekend and wrote them in real time. Networks kept coverage commercial-free and built a common script of careful updates, verified facts, and restrained tone. Anchors learned when to remove their glasses and breathe before a hard line. Producers learned how to handle a live link from a police basement and what that power could reveal. Viewers learned that news could follow every hour of public grief. Schools and stations saved the tapes for study and training. The JFK assassination taught the craft a durable form that still governs long breakings. Inside the Dallas department, the mood shifted from strain to disbelief, and then to self-scrutiny. Officers who had spent 2 days without sleep faced a second crime in their own building. Commanders sealed rooms, interviewed colleagues, and searched for the points where procedure had failed. The gunman sat in a cell and asked for cigarettes and for familiar faces. Lawyers began to circle the case while the county prepared for a first appearance. A judge signed papers late at night. The JFK assassination now carried a set of investigations that would map every hallway and every decision. Sunday night drew people back to churches and to living rooms where neighbors gathered with coffee and food. Children fell asleep early while adults spoke about where they had been at noon on Friday. Radios stayed low as the television showed the rotunda and the slow line that never seemed to end. Phone calls crossed states, and friends found each other after years of quiet. Some wrote letters because they could not find the right voice. The JFK assassination knit strangers together in short acts of kindness that people would remember for the rest of their lives. In Dallas, the family of the fallen patrolman received visitors without pause. Fellow officers stood watch at the door and brought meals that went untouched. Neighbors offered rides, childcare, and errands. The department planned honors with care and promised to carry the burden with the family. The suspect's body would soon require its own arrangements in a city strained by rumor and attention. Reporters tried to approach and were turned away. The JFK assassination left grief in homes that had never met the president and felt bound to the day. In the months after the JFK assassination, the federal government moved to gather facts under a single roof and to calm a country adrift. The president asked a respected chief justice to chair a body that would study the crime and the reactions it set loose. Leaders in Congress agreed that a public account would help restore trust. The task was vast, and the clock was short. The name that soon fixed in memory was the Warren Commission, and its charge was simple to say and hard to carry out. 7 members were chosen to span parties, branches, and regions, so the work would look like the country it served. The Chief Justice led a senator from each party, 2 representatives, a former CIA director, and a former high commissioner who knew hard negotiations. Staff attorneys were drawn from across the profession and given narrow lanes to push forward. Their method favored interviews, affidavits, and careful reviews of physical records. The JFK assassination would be studied in a manner that matched the law more than the drama that had stunned the world. They faced a flood of paper and film. There were police reports from the plaza, hospital notes, witness statements from streets and windows. There were photographs, radio logs, and reams of background files on the man arrested and then slain. There was the short life of a second gunman who stepped from a crowd with a pistol. The staff marked each item and sent it down lines for study. The promise was to follow facts wherever they led and to write plainly at the end. The country watched and worried. Rumors ran through towns that Friday had been the start of something larger. People asked about foreign hands, about rival agencies at war, about money, and about rage. The commission knew that silence would darken those thoughts. It tried to balance quiet work with brief public updates that did not rush past the evidence. Teams returned to the plaza with cameras, transits, and tape to fix angles and times. They studied the car, the route, and the slope that changed sight lines near the triple underpass. They measured distances from the window to the street and from the curb to the back seat. They filmed a car at the same speed and built a frame-by-frame clock. They sought to match witness memory with physics and to turn a noon of shock into weighted points on a chart. The work felt slow and exact. Ballistics experts examined the rifle recovered from the warehouse and compared it to the bullets and shells in evidence. Marks on metal were studied through glass until patterns grew clear. They modeled a sequence in which one bullet struck both the president and the governor, while another delivered the final wound. The idea was simple and drew on geometry and posture inside the car. The phrase "single bullet" would come to stand for this path. Medical evidence came in with gaps and confusion that complicated the task. The autopsy had taken place far from Dallas in a military hospital under heavy pressure and with many eyes in the room. Notes were incomplete and diagrams hard to align with photographs. The staff sought to reconcile the record with clothing and with witness descriptions from the emergency rooms. It was slow work that fueled argument inside the building. The JFK assassination thus pushed the commission to decide amidst imperfect files and human strain. They studied the life of the man named in the first hours and tried to fit motive to means. Records showed foreign travel, a short time in a distant port city, a return with a young family, and a trail of jobs that paid little. Friends and co-workers described a moody debater who felt wronged and craved a mark on history. The rifle order under another name and the photographs from a backyard set a frame. The commission did not claim to know his heart. It wrote that opportunity had met intent. The man who shot the suspect in the police basement became a separate line of work. Staff traced his business, his friends, his debts, and his days before the act. They looked for messages, for meetings, and for ties that ran to organized crime or to politics. The trail showed a man of impulse who lived in a small orbit around his club and the station. The commission found no solid bridge between the two men before that Sunday. It wrote that grief and anger had sparked a fatal act. Rumors of foreign plots pressed on the staff from the start. The recent crisis in the Caribbean and the long stare across oceans gave every whisper a context. The man at the center had once tried on new flags and had handed out leaflets with bold claims in another city. Intelligence agencies opened files and answered questions with care. Some answers were frank and some were hedged by rules. The JFK assassination seemed to invite a map with many arrows. The evidence did not hold those arrows fast. By late summer, the outline of findings grew firm. Writers began to stitch the narrative to the record and to assign footnotes that tracked every claim to a page. The report would stand alone in one volume for readers and would be backed by many more volumes of testimony and exhibits. The prose tried to walk with calm steps and to avoid words that could not be proved. The JFK assassination would be set down as a chain of facts and times. The core conclusion named the man who had fired from the warehouse window and said he had acted alone. It said the same of the man who struck in the basement 2 days later. It described a police response that had been brave and flawed. It found no evidence of a wider plot that could stand against the record. It called for better protection in cities and for clearer ties among agencies that guarded the president. The JFK assassination thus became a case and a spur to change at once. When the report appeared, many readers accepted its restraint and its logic. Others felt the gaps and pushed back. They said witnesses were uneven and that some files had been slow to open. They said the single bullet sequence felt like a bridge too far. They said the autopsy record left questions that no chart could cure. The commission answered by pointing to photographs, to tests, and to sworn words. The JFK assassination had become a mirror where trust and doubt both saw themselves. In time, the supporting volumes reached libraries, though some sensitive files stayed closed for many years. Scholars and citizens read the pages and traced the footnotes back to the boxes. Television producers built long programs from the record and the gaps. New questions rose from fresh angles on film and from interviews with people who had not spoken before. The commission had promised clarity and delivered as much as its tools allowed. The JFK assassination still drew study from anyone who opened the volumes. The report also pressed changes that would reshape protection. Routes would be treated as corridors to be sealed from above as well as from the curb. Windows along key turns would be watched or closed. Coordination with local forces would become more formal and more demanding. The speed of medical transport would be planned with backups. Communications among cars would be tighter and more redundant. The JFK assassination thus became a source of rules that later generations would take for granted in every city. Inside the body there had been tension between speed and care, and between candor and the limits of secrecy around intelligence files. Staff argued over phrasing that might comfort the public or might mislead. Some wanted more hearings in the open. Others feared that cameras would turn procedure into theater. Drafts moved back and forth with edits that tried to keep faith with evidence while protecting sources that were still active. The JFK assassination forced trade-offs that the report only hinted at. Years later, another congressional body would revisit the case and weigh acoustic tests and new interviews. That review would say there was a high probability of a second gunman, though its basis would remain debated and its science would be questioned over time. The earlier report would stand as the main record for most institutions. The commission's work would still be taught and mined for lessons on method. The JFK assassination would thus carry 2 official readings that shared more pages than their headlines suggested. Behind the pages were people who had lived an awful weekend and then spent months reliving it through questions. Clerks, doctors, agents, and passers-by sat for sworn sessions and tried to be exact. Some had watched a friend fall. Some had run toward danger. Some had only heard echoes and still felt guilty that they could not be sure. The commission thanked them by name and placed their words in the volumes. The JFK assassination remained a story told by a city as much as by experts. The phrase Dallas motorcade shooting began to appear in some accounts as a plain label for a scene that had once been a welcome. The commission did not use that phrase often, yet the image of a city block remained central to its logic. The work kept returning to the window and the car and the timing on a small patch of ground. It returned less often to grand designs and quiet rooms. That choice shaped the answers it could give. It also set limits that critics would test for years. When the work closed, the volumes went to shelves and the single volume went to kitchen tables where families argued in low voices. Courts and agencies kept copies within easy reach. Reporters annotated their own sets. The report could not heal the loss or clear every doubt. It did fix a baseline for the story the nation would tell itself. The JFK assassination then moved from the file room to daily life, where memory, custom, and law would keep shaping the long aftermath. After the JFK assassination, public doubt gathered and grew into a second history told in questions. The first hours brought shock. The first months brought arguments. People wrote letters, joined late-night talks, and saved clippings in shoeboxes. They studied still frames and small gestures. They wondered whether chance could carry such weight alone. The official report tried to calm the water and could not close it. Polls soon showed a majority who felt there was more to say. Doubt became a civic habit. It was fed by grief, by rumor, and by real gaps in the record. The long debate became part of how the country remembered the day. Images did much of the work that words could not after the JFK assassination. A home movie from the plaza leaked slowly into view and rewrote memory in bursts of color. Viewers felt the shock return as the frame jumped and hands lifted. Photographs of a rifle in a small yard raised new questions about names and dates. Television built long specials that walked through each second with careful voice. For many, seeing seemed to deepen doubt rather than resolve it. Pauses between frames looked like gaps in truth. When the pictures stopped, silence filled with theory. The power of images pushed curiosity into every family room in the country. Questions about the man at the center kept spreading after the JFK assassination. He had defected and returned. He had marched under one banner and spoken of another. He had visited embassies in a southern capital weeks before the crime and left a trail of patchy notes and mismatched memories. Some said a visitor used his name while cameras made fuzzy records. Some said there were calls that did not match his voice. These fragments did not prove direction, yet they made many feel the story had too many rooms. Ambiguity became fuel. In the absence of clear lines, people drew their maps and shared them late into the night. One set of doubts focused on where the shots came from in the minutes of the JFK assassination. Many in the plaza swore the sound rushed from the little hill by the fence. Others pointed to the tall window above the curve. Echoes confused even trained ears. Later, a test of noise on a police recording seemed to show a fourth impulse and the chance of a second gunman. Years later, that test would be challenged by other scientists who placed the impulses after the shots. The bumpy path of that claim showed how science could enter public grief and leave it unsettled again. The argument never fully went quiet. The single bullet explanation stood at the center of the JFK assassination debate for many years. Staff drew lines through bodies and seats and timed a moving car against filmed frames. They said one bullet could do more than common sense allowed when angles and posture were placed in order. Critics answered that wounds seemed misaligned and that the damage asked too much of a single round. Some raised the issue of recovered weight and photographs of fragments. Books and lectures spread the challenge widely. The commission answered with geometry and tests, and many accepted those answers. Many did not, and the idea kept its stubborn pull for many years. Other theories sought bigger hands behind the JFK assassination. Some pointed to intelligence plots against a Caribbean leader and to meetings between informants and crime figures. They noted that agencies had hidden programs for years and told only parts when asked. They said this secrecy made trust impossible. Some argued the crime was payback for planned raids. Others said it was revenge from gang bosses angry at crackdowns. Still others turned their eyes abroad and spoke of distant services that moved in shadows. None of these claims found firm proof in court. Yet the pattern of secrecy and partial truths kept the public ready to suspect more in later years. A dramatic chapter in doubt arrived from a New Orleans courtroom that followed the JFK assassination by several years. A local prosecutor announced he had found a plot that tied a businessman, a pilot, and a restless drifter to a murder plan. He said meetings had taken place in small apartments and back rooms. Witnesses gave vivid stories that shifted under pressure. The case reached trial and drew national attention. The jury returned a quick acquittal, and the record showed more confusion than clarity. Supporters of the prosecutor said he had battled a wall of power. Critics said he had chased wind. The debate sharpened but did not resolve anything. The man who shot the suspect on live television became his own source of speculation tied to the JFK assassination. He ran a club, knew police officers by name, and had brushed against figures from the world of vice. He gave shifting reasons for his act and later offered hints of larger stories. Investigators mapped his calls, his money, and his habits. They found debts, pride, and impulse. They did not find a clear line to a larger plan. Still, the idea took hold because the moment had looked too clean and too close. People saw a shortcut to silence and trusted their instincts more than the record at times. Medical questions kept pace with every other dispute around the JFK assassination. Doctors in Dallas acted fast in a crowded room. Doctors in Bethesda acted later under heavy pressure and with many witnesses. Notes were lost or incomplete. Photographs were disputed, and chain of custody grew tattered. Years later, new boards asked for missing items and could not find all of them. Diagrams did not match every recollection. Clothing told one story and images told another. These gaps did not write a different crime by themselves. They did write uncertainty into the file and gave critics room to plant more questions that never quite ran out for many careful readers. The wider climate made every doubt louder after the JFK assassination. The late 60s brought more murders of public figures and more shock. The long war in Asia wore down trust in official words. Later, a break in an office and a cover story from the highest places. deepened that loss. Files about secret programs and domestic spying reached the front page and kept it for months. People learned that agencies had hidden truths when it suited them. They then looked back to Dallas with a harder eye. Memory and new scandal blended until the weekend in question carried every fear at once and colored each later conversation about responsibility. New records appeared in waves that followed the event and the years of argument. A law ordered agencies to gather files and release them unless strong reasons blocked the way. Boxes moved into quiet public rooms and readers lined up with pencils and notes. Many pages confirmed what was known. Many pages added texture. A few pages stirred fresh debate because names and dates did not fit cleanly. Some files stayed sealed or arrived with thick black lines. Each release became an event that felt like progress and like proof of more hidden doors. The pattern encouraged the hunt to continue in endless loops for readers across the political spectrum. Writers and filmmakers shaped the public mind as much as official bodies after the JFK assassination. Books with careful footnotes sat beside novels that imagined hidden rooms. A film in the early 90s argued for a vast design and reached millions. Viewers left theaters with vivid scenes and a long list of claims. The debate about art and truth flared and then settled into daily talk. A new generation grew up with that story as their first path into the subject. The alias Dallas motorcade shooting became a phrase in scripts and captions. Popular culture kept the case open long after courts had closed for most people who cared deeply. Polling showed a steady current of doubt that did not fade after the JFK assassination. Majorities often told surveyors they believed more than one person had been involved. Explanations varied by year and by generation. Some cited a gut sense that nothing so large could hinge on one man. Some cited the shape of the autopsy record. Others cited recordings, notes, or missing files. The pattern reflected a human truth about tragic events. When the cost is great, people expect a plan behind it. When facts are messy, people expect someone hid them. The case became a canvas for that tension, and it never lost its public grip in America. Responsible voices tried to keep skepticism from turning reckless after the JFK assassination. Careful writers urged patience with evidence and caution with sweeping claims. They accepted that doubt had a place and that institutions sometimes fail. They ask that conclusions match what can be shown. Many historians stayed with the finding that one man fired from the warehouse window. Some noted the later view that a conspiracy was probable, then weighed the shaky base of that view. They taught students why some gaps do not change the core story. Humility became a working tool rather than a pose. It asks for precision, proportion, memory, and care, with every difficult claim. In the end, the weeks and years after the JFK assassination left two tracks that ran side by side. One track fixed a record of times, places, and names that courts and commissions could defend. The other track kept people talking, reading, and watching for the thing that might settle it all. Both shaped the culture and the families who lived with the loss. Both still echo in quiet ways. The government would answer doubt with new rules, new guidelines, and a different style of public movement. That change began quickly and kept growing in the decades that followed. Those rules soon touched every city a president would visit. In the wake of the JFK assassination, the protection of leaders, the shape of media coverage, and the reach of federal coordination changed at once. Continuity had worked in the moment, yet the system had felt exposed. The shock turned into checklists, new rules, and a calmer kind of choreography that would follow every president through every city. Agencies asked where risk lived and how to move through public life without closing it down. The answers arrived in steps and kept growing over years. The Secret Service reviewed every stage that had touched the motorcade before the JFK assassination. It expanded hiring and training and brought new attention to long-range threats. Advance agents began to treat the skyline as a field that needed control from curb to roof. Windows along key turns were watched or kept shut by prior agreement. Rooftops were posted when manpower allowed. The open car that once signaled warmth gave way to cars with armor and glass that could blunt a rifle. Convertibles faded from the plan except for slow and controlled settings. Speed and spacing inside the rolling column were tightened so that an agent could reach the rear step in a breath. Advance work turned from custom to craft. Routes were no longer a tour of landmarks. They were a series of safe corridors that linked screened venues. Building managers were contacted weeks ahead and asked to list access points and delivery hours. Police commanders were brought into the planning rooms earlier and given clear maps of posts and lines of sight. Fire and medical leaders joined the table to speak about hospitals and transport times. The command post at each site grew larger and more connected. Radios were checked for overlap so that city units and federal teams could hear the same call without delay. Medical planning moved higher in priority once reality revealed how thin luck can be. Motorcades added medical staff and better equipment. A doctor rode closer to the principal. Ambulances were placed with more care along the route. The nearest trauma hospitals were marked by name and by minute. Doctors in those rooms were briefed in advance about timing and access. Emergency drills shifted tone and treated gunshot trauma as a realistic event rather than as a remote exercise. The practice of heading for the nearest capable facility became rule, not habit. The lesson was simple and it stayed that way. Airfields and rope lines received new attention afterward. Airports created wider buffers between arrival stairs and the friendly crowd. The rope line remained a feature of American politics. Yet agents learned to shape it in shorter arcs and to break it into segments. Press risers stood farther back and higher up. Credential checks grew stricter. The aim was still contact that felt human. The difference lay in the thin layers of control that kept a handshaking moment from turning into a gap in protection. Small changes like these added up to a calmer kind of day. Interagency sharing took on a new urgency soon after. Threat letters, odd phone calls, and reports about unstable visitors moved more quickly between local offices and federal desks. Files that once sat in separate boxes began to flow into the same room. Analysts learned to spot patterns across cities. Field agents learned to call in measures of concern rather than wait for a clear crime. The old habit of keeping walls between departments gave way to bridges that could carry warnings before a visit. The culture did not flip in a night. It moved with steady pressure from leaders who had watched a city fall silent at noon. Law and policy evolved in the years around the event. and some steps carried the clear imprint of the JFK assassination. A constitutional amendment clarified succession and the transfer of power if a president became disabled. Hearings explored whether federal law should reach the tools that had been bought through the mail with little check. The decade later would see tighter rules on firearms sales by dealers and steps that touched interstate commerce. Protection for candidates grew in scope after later blows. Yet the spur from Dallas remained close in mind. The system learned to plan for the whole contest, not only for a presidency already won. The White House press operation changed its rhythm. Pool coverage became more defined so that small spaces did not turn into a crush. Camera positions were set with more deliberation. Briefings favored clear timing and fast correction of rumor. The permanent staff learned how to run a day that aimed at light rather than heat. The working rules between the press and the protective detail were written in plainer terms. Each side understood the other had an essential job. The picture of a president among citizens stayed central. The path to that picture became more formal. Television absorbed lessons that would shape its craft for decades after the JFK assassination. Anchors and editors built the model for long, continuous coverage that stayed sober and careful. They learned to hold time with verified lines and to admit uncertainty without fear. They debated whether to carry live scenes from police spaces. They made choices about language for wounds and death that respected families and viewers. Many stations began to keep simple black screens or light music ready for sudden pauses. The live murder of a suspect became a permanent caution. Newsrooms wrote rules for placement of cameras, for distance, and for who could stand on a police ramp. Newspapers and wire services tuned their systems in those months. They created teams dedicated to obituaries of sitting leaders so that haste would not overwrite care. They built checklists for emergency editions and clarified how to label unconfirmed reports. Editors grew more strict about the difference between a witness memory and a proved fact. Letters pages filled, and papers learned to publish doubt without sacrificing proportion. The craft found a way to honor grief and still hold a line against claims that could not stand. Public information became a federal task in its own right. Rumor moved faster than any office, so the office had to move earlier. The executive branch learned to name a single voice who would speak at set times with what was known and what was not yet known. Agencies learned to pool updates so that families and city halls heard the same baseline. Hotlines were set up in crises that followed. The aim was to lower the temperature without softening the truth. Clarity became a tool of safety. Ceremony also taught security new habits after the JFK assassination. The state funeral drew leaders from across the world with almost no notice. The Capitol learned to blend honor with protection at a scale it had not seen before. Motorcades for foreign heads were staggered and shielded. Lodging was set with care so that routes did not overlap. Military units stood double roles of escort and guard. The city's map became a puzzle that could be solved only by many hands in one room. The work foreshadowed the later growth of joint command centers that would mark large events for the rest of the century. The car itself became a project. The presidential limousine was taken apart and rebuilt with heavier armor and clearer glass. Engineers accepted that looks would yield to safety. Future cars were designed with sealed roofs and doors that turned into shields. Steps and handholds were revised so that an agent could reach and hold his place under strain. The fleet grew so that options existed for every setting. The symbol of access became the symbol of measured distance, and the public adjusted to the sight in time. Local police culture shifted as well. Departments built plans for visits that treated the sky as part of the street. Tactical teams trained for high-angle eyes and for searches of buildings near turns. Officers learned simple rules for windows and freight schedules on the morning of a route. Training films used the plaza as a case study. New officers were taught to look up as often as they looked across. The goal was not to harden a city. It was to treat a route as a living thing that needed care in 3 dimensions. Education spread beyond police rooms. Hospitals trained staff for sudden mass attention as much as for sudden trauma. City halls wrote scripts for public statements that would keep calm in the first hour of a crisis. Schools practiced silent dismissals that eased traffic for emergency work. Clergy networks built lines of contact to help families find each other. The social fabric learned a few quiet skills that only show in hard moments. None of it brought back what was lost. All of it honored the need to be ready. The phrase Dallas motorcade shooting took on bureaucratic weight as policies were updated and drills were filmed. It was a shorthand that anchored why small rules now governed windows and rooftops and press pens. It kept the choice in view. The country would still meet its leaders in the open. The meeting would feel safer to the eye and quieter to the ear. The balance held because people learned to accept limits that were explained and fair. The open hand at the rope line still felt like a human moment. It simply sat inside a ring of care. Not every change showed up on paper. Some of the shift lived in judgment. Agents learned to say no when a scene felt wrong without having to write a long memo. Chiefs learned to accept that call without resentment. Mayors learned that a schedule needed room to shrink. Campaign staffs learned that a headline was not worth a risk that could be felt by anyone standing on the curb. The culture moved from improvisation toward prudence. It still left room for contact that mattered. Family protection grew wider. The circle around a president's spouse and children tightened. Travel was planned with more lead time. Schools were asked to keep lists and routes private. Agents who once rotated in and out of family duty began to build longer assignments so that trust ran both ways. The same logic later extended to former presidents and to those who sought the office. The nation accepted the cost because it understood the stakes. The federal government also reviewed how history is kept. Evidence gathered by many hands needed clear custody and a public path. Archives strengthened rules for intake and access. Agencies learned to write down more and to state limits when they could not share. The long arc of release would test patience in years to come. Still, the principle became firmer. Records of a national trauma belong to the nation in time. The media and the state reached a new working truce. Reporters accepted some boundaries at scenes that could turn dangerous. Police accepted that transparency built trust when rumors ran hot. The White House accepted that questions would be sharp on days that hurt. Audiences accepted that some pictures would wait until families had been told. Each side adjusted without losing purpose. That balance did not hold in every case. It held often enough to matter. Over time, the sum of all these changes became a new normal that few paused to name. People still lined streets and waved. Presidents still stopped to shake hands. Cameras still told the story. The pace felt slightly slower around the edges. The lines looked straighter. The rooms felt more organized. The feeling many carried was simple. The country had learned to keep its rituals without inviting avoidable harm. That was an achievement born of pain and careful work. The JFK assassination had forced the system to think across agencies, across cities, and across crafts. It taught events staff to ask small questions early. It taught editors to hold a long watch with steady tone. It taught police to see the geometry above the curb. It taught doctors and drivers to move as one. Each lesson sat quietly inside later days that ended without news. Those were the days the changes were made for. They were the days that let people go home the same way they left. What took shape after the JFK assassination did not end the argument about causes or blame. It answered a different need and kept answering it for decades. It asked what a free country must do to meet its leaders in public without closing itself into fear. The reply grew from practice rather than from speeches. Motorcades became safer. Coverage became steadier. Communication became clearer. That was the federal response in its true form. It was work that aimed at quiet outcomes. In time, those outcomes felt like ordinary days again. The country kept its pageantry and kept its perspective. The loudest changes faded into routine. The quiet rules stayed near the surface for anyone who knew how to look. The plaza where it had happened remained a place to visit, a place to study, and a place to feel a pause. The rest of the story would belong to memory and to film, and to the way a city corner can become a national room. In the long years after the JFK assassination, memory gathered in images, places, and rituals that shaped how Americans retell the day. Home movies and still photos traveled from living rooms to classrooms. They became anchors for stories told softly at night and in bright halls by day. Dealey Plaza turned into a crossroads where people looked up at windows, walked the grass, and paused to feel the scale of the street. Grief settled into craft, and craft settled into care. The country learned to live with a corner that speaks without raising its voice. The most studied home movie of the JFK assassination began on a pedestal by the curve with a simple attempt to capture a smiling motorcade. Its shaky frames, bright and close, fixed a path through the moments no sentence could contain. For years it lived behind permissions and careful hands. Then it reached television and the public gaze, and it changed how people remembered time. Scholars slowed it, indexed it, and matched it to clocks and maps. Families watched it once and set it aside because the frame felt too intimate to keep looping. Other films and photographs from that day settled into the archive of public feeling. A Polaroid by the wall caught a blur of grass and a frozen instant. A wire service image framed the limousine and the faces around it with the clarity of hard luck. Short reels shot from the opposite side added angles that made the plaza feel like a room with mirrors. Each piece brought a different kind of truth, and each piece left gaps that viewers filled with experience and fear and hope. In Dallas, the former warehouse became a museum where the JFK assassination is studied through photographs, testimony, and the city's own memory. Visitors step into quiet rooms and look toward a corner window that is preserved as a teaching point rather than as a stage. They trace the route on a large map, listen to audio accounts, and linger over small objects that carry the weight of an ordinary day that turned. Outside, the plaza carries plaques and the steady press of footsteps. School groups stand in the sun and learn how public space can hold both welcome and risk. Across the river from the capital, a hill with an eternal flame holds the nation's most visited grave from that era. Children learn the image of a riderless horse and remember a small salute that went around the world. The walk to the plot moves slow and respectful. Families speak low. Veterans take off their caps. Strangers fall quiet. The grave ties a private sorrow to a public promise that the country will remember the cost of leadership. Anniversaries of that day return each November with moments of silence and simple remarks in the city that lived it. Some years bring large crowds and official programs. Other years the day feels local and subdued, with flowers and small gatherings near the curb. Residents have learned to share space with visitors who arrive with cameras and careful steps. The plaza holds both groups without favor and lets the wind and the traffic do most of the talking. Classrooms use the event to teach media literacy, civic process, and empathy for witnesses who did not ask to become part of history. Teachers play short clips and then turn down the lights so students can think before they speak. Assignments ask for clear distinctions between memory, rumor, and proof. Primary sources help students see how ordinary handwriting and plain voices carry the truth of a day. The case also opens a path into discussion of how a free society manages doubt without losing trust. Families carry their own archives of that day in small ways that matter. A grandfather tells where he was when the bulletin came across a car radio. A grandmother points to a black ribbon pinned by a church door and remembers a long Sunday line. A mother keeps a folded newspaper inside a cookbook because it was the closest safe place at the time. These acts create a bridge from public shock to private care. Language around the JFK assassination has its own gravity, and each term shapes feeling. Some writers choose the plain label that calls it the Dallas motorcade shooting, and in doing so, they point back to a civic space rather than to a single tower of power. Others hold to the formal name because it keeps the presidency at the center of loss and duty. Both choices carry weight, and both tell readers where to stand. In the end, plain words help most, because plain words let the facts breathe. The city that holds the geography of the event has lived with a long shadow and a long patience. Leaders work to welcome visitors without turning sorrow into spectacle. Residents shaped a civic story that included regret, hospitality, and steady education. Arts groups marked the anniversary with music and quiet installations. Local journalists kept accounts of the people who witnessed the day and the people who kept the site. The digital age changed how the story is discussed, saved, and seen. Scans of documents live online and allow readers to compare notes from home. Clips are stabilized and shared, sometimes with care and sometimes without context. Forums can sharpen insight or harden error, and both effects travel quickly. Archivists respond with better guides and with tools that help people ask clear questions before they decide. Public records from the era of the JFK assassination keep moving into the light through long schedules and careful review. The law that gathered files under one banner promised eventual release and taught patience by necessity. Each batch of pages offers modest gains in detail along with the occasional surprise. Families of officials find their letters in boxes, and their names join the footnotes of a shared archive. As the process continues, the baseline story remains largely the same, but the texture grows richer and more human. Writers and filmmakers keep returning to the event because it touches craft at every level. Documentaries seek patience and balance, building timelines and letting witnesses tell small, steady truths. Feature films compress events into strong arcs that draw emotion quickly and invite debate later. Novels place side characters in the stream and ask what an ordinary person would carry home after a clear noon turned hard. Music and visual art lift up memory through symbol and echo rather than through the minute of the clock. The place itself keeps teaching because the event was not a distant battlefield, but a set of ordinary blocks where people still cross at lunch. You can watch the light change on the bricks and hear the rumble under the bridge. You can sense the slope where tires hummed and see how a corner frames the sky. Taxi horns and train whistles carry through the air and make it easy to understand why echoes moved people that day. A city that grows and renews itself still leaves traces of the old lines that guide the feet of visitors who want to be gentle with the past. Other places carry threads of the event in quieter tones. The hospital changed and expanded but keeps an old wing in photographs and staff lore. The home where a simple package drew a joke about curtain rods sits in neighborhood memory that knows more than maps can show. Graves for the lesser-known figures draw rare visitors who leave coins and silence. These places widen the frame without turning the city into a museum beyond living use. Public life keeps lessons from the event close to the ground. Leaders visit schools, factories, and churches with care. Yet they still choose to be seen in the open because that choice honors the job. Citizens respond with steadiness, lines, and a general sense that presence matters. People accept small boundaries if those boundaries protect the shared moment. The scene feels different now, but it still belongs to the same chain of contact that shaped the older day. Survivors and witnesses of the event recorded oral histories that pulled the listener close without demanding a verdict. They recall routine details like boxed lunches, the smell of mimeograph ink, and a clock that stood a few minutes fast. They recall the sudden sound, the running, and the long hours under harsh lights. These records guard the humanity of a day that can otherwise be flattened into charts and arrows. They help new generations feel the weight of service, confusion, and care that rose all at once. The meaning of the JFK assassination has moved from breaking news to shared heritage. Yet it has not gone quiet. It shapes how the country thinks about safety and mourning and about the bond between leaders and crowds. It shapes how we teach film, how we honor witnesses, and how we mark a public place with care rather than with spectacle. It asks for patience when records open and for kindness when questions are hard. In that spirit, the country keeps walking the blocks, keeps listening to the film, and keeps letting the site speak with a steady voice that does not hurry. From those habits grows a calm understanding that prepares the ground for what endures. The plaza, the reels, and the rooms of remembrance now live like steady lights along a familiar road. People visit, learn, and go home a little quieter together today. From that quiet grows the lasting part, the slow work that outlives a season and becomes what endures. In the years since the JFK assassination, the country has learned to carry shock without letting it rule daily life. What endures is a long practice of steadiness that folds public grief into shared customs. People line streets with quiet faces, watch carefully chosen words, and return to work with a little more gentleness than before. The lesson is not to harden against sorrow. The lesson is to meet it with order, kindness, and a memory that lives in places everyone can visit. From the JFK assassination came a clear sense that openness must be balanced by care. Leaders still step into rope lines and wave, yet the space is shaped with purpose. Agents look up as often as they look across. Local officers think about windows, schedules, and where a route breathes. Most people never notice these layers. They notice that the handshake still happens, and that matters more than the scaffolding that allows it. Another durable piece is the way news carries hard days. The model built during the JFK assassination favors calm voices, clear timestamps, and a willingness to say what is not yet known. Audiences now expect anchors to slow down and to lean on verified lines. Stations keep space ready for long hours without hurry. Viewers bring patience because they remember how fast rumor can pull people off course. What endures most strongly sits closer to the ground. The JFK assassination revealed how quickly strangers can become helpers. Nurses stepped into hallways and made room. Police officers waved cars through with steady hands and tired eyes. Bystanders pointed, comforted, and shared simple truths when asked to speak. Those habits remain in every city. They are the first tools people reach for when the day tilts. Memory also lives in places that ask for a slower walk. Museums keep windows and boxes in careful rooms so visitors can study without spectacle. The plaza remains an everyday crossing that also holds a quiet pause. Films roll on screens where students learn how images can help and mislead. Teachers ask for patience with sources and for grace toward witnesses whose senses were shaken. The country has grown used to listening longer before deciding. Law and policy carry their own long echo. Succession is clearer, medical response is faster, and coordination across agencies is more stable. The JFK assassination pressed the idea that records must be kept and opened in time. Archives built channels that moved boxes from locked rooms to reading tables. Patience is part of the promise. So is the belief that sunlight serves the Republic even when answers feel plain or disappointing. Families live with a nearer legacy. The house that lost a husband and father, the family that lost a son and brother, and the families of officers and officials who did their best all keep their own calendars. Anniversaries arrive with mixed weather inside the room. The country learned to leave space for private rites, even when public ritual fills the day. That respect is part of the national fabric now, and it shows in small choices made quietly. Citizens carry another lasting habit. The JFK assassination taught many to ask for proof with care. and to balance skepticism with proportion. Doubt has a place, and so does patience with evidence. The healthiest conversation holds both. It listens, tests, and rests on what can be shown. That posture protects communities from spirals that feed on fear. It also protects institutions by asking them to earn trust rather than assume it. Another endurance is a careful restraint in how the day is described. Newsrooms, museums, and classrooms choose plain language and spare images. The aim is to honor the lives at the center without turning the scene into a spectacle or a model for harm. The JFK assassination sits in the record as a warning, not an invitation. That ethic has grown stronger over time. It shapes captions, scripts, tours, and the pace of public events. There is also a global thread that has not frayed. The JFK assassination showed allies and rivals that a democracy can absorb a violent loss and keep its course. Messages of sorrow crossed borders and built a habit of shared mourning that still appears when nations face sudden tragedy. Protocols for visiting leaders grew steadier. So did the language of condolence that respects difference while naming common grief. Technology keeps extending the archive. Better scans reveal notes once hard to read. Stabilized film lets viewers see small motions without distortion. Search tools help students gather threads across many boxes. With each advance, the core story does not change much, yet context grows richer. The JFK assassination thus remains a living classroom where method matters as much as conclusion. There is endurance in daily life as well. Simple routines resumed after the funeral and kept the country from drifting. People went back to desks and kitchens and bus stops and found that work steadies the heart. The JFK assassination entered talk without swallowing it. Children grew up learning they could be both careful and open. Adults learned they could be both watchful and kind. The blend holds most days without comment. Language will keep shifting as generations put fresh frames around the same hour. Some prefer to call it the Dallas motorcade shooting because it points to a public space. Others stay with a formal name because it keeps the office in view. Either way, the duty of memory remains the same. Speak plainly. Avoid drama that flatters the teller. Let the facts and the people who live them set the tone. What endures is also a promise to the young. Schools tell the story at a human pace and ask students to think with care. Households tell it softly and remind children that public life belongs to them too. The JFK assassination becomes a lesson in responsibility, wrapped in compassion. It says we can move forward without forgetting. It says we can honor leaders without turning them into distant figures. It says we can argue and still hold together. The place that holds the memory keeps teaching with patience. Office workers cross at lunch and give a nod to visitors who stop at the curb. Trains move through the yards and remind everyone that cities do not pause for long. Tourists come with cameras and leave with quiet faces. Residents keep the streets clean and the tone welcoming. The JFK assassination does not own the city, yet it lives there like a respectful neighbor who waves and goes on. Across decades, the most important endurance is simple faith in ordinary days. Every community knows that life is lived mostly in small rooms and on sidewalks where neighbors wave. The shock that followed the JFK assassination did not erase that truth. It clarified it. It reminded people that meaning is built in plain acts of care, in work done well, and in patience shown to those who are hurting. It encouraged public servants to prepare quietly and to speak clearly when needed. It encouraged citizens to look after each other when sirens sound and to return to their routines when the hour allows. The strength of a free society is not loud. It is steady, decent, and visible in the way people share a street. In the end, what endures is a way of standing together when days break and a way of stepping forward after. The story lives in rooms of study, in stones, and in a city corner that teaches without raising its voice. It lives in the promise that access and safety can share the same street. Let the lights dim. Let the fan hum. Settle back and breathe. The work is to keep faith with one another. The rest is to go on, steady and kind.